The air smelled of salt and steel. It was the year 1853, and the waters of Edo Bay lay still, like black glass. But on the horizon, for dark shapes drifted closer shapes unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen. Steam poured from their iron bellies, and their guns' long, cold, unblinking faced the shore like the eyes of a predator. They called them Kurafune, the black ships. Commodore Matthew Perry had arrived from across the Pacific, carrying letters from a distant president and the threat of war if Japan would not open her gates. For more than 2 centuries before that day, the island empire had been a sealed world. The Tokugawa shogunate had enforced Sakoku, a policy of isolation so strict that even the tides seemed to turn inward. No foreigner could enter without permission. No Japanese could leave under pain of death. The world beyond was little more than rumor and maps half believed. Inside this quiet cage, the samurai still walked the streets, their hands on the hilts of swords polished by generations. Their code was the marrow of the nation. Loyalty without question, death without fear, honor without compromise. But now the smoke of the black ships curled into the sky like an omen. Japan's walls were not stone. They were will, and will, once bent, rarely straightens again. Perry's guns never fired, yet their echo rolled across the empire. In the months that followed, the treaties signed in hurried ink began to bleed away Japan's isolation. Western merchants came with rifles and rails, telegraphs and textiles. Old words shogun, ronin, still hung in the air, but they were already becoming ghosts. In the quiet rooms of Edo Castle, the shogunate trembled. Power was slipping like sand between armored fingers. And far from the capital, young men with sharp eyes and sharper ambitions began to whisper, "Japan must change, or Japan will die." The change came with fire. The Boshin War of 1868 was brief, but its shadow was long. Imperial forces fighting under the banner of the Emperor Meiji clashed with the shogunate loyalists, in battles that tore through cities and rice fields alike. Samurai faced samurai, not in ritual duels, but in the smoke and chaos of modern war. Muskets cracked where katanas once sang. When the guns fell silent, the shogunate was gone. The emperor was no longer a distant figure cloaked in ritual and incense. He was the sun around which the new Japan would turn. The Meiji Restoration, they called it. But restoration is a strange word. It suggests something old made whole again. In truth, Japan was being remade into something it had never been before. Feudal domains were abolished. The samurai class, once the spine of the nation, was dissolved, their swords banned from the streets. Factories rose where castle walls once stood. Railways split the landscape like new veins carrying the blood of industry. For some, it was a rebirth. For others, it was an unmaking. A former samurai named Takamori, who had fought to bring the emperor to power, now watched in dismay as the old ways vanished. In 1877, he led the Satsuma Rebellion, a final stand of the warrior class. His forces fought with swords against rifles, with honor against inevitability. They lost, and with them something ancient slipped quietly into the grave. Yet, Japan did not slow. In just a generation, the empire transformed from an isolated archipelago into a modern industrial power. The ships in its harbors now bristled with steel guns of its own. Its army drilled in European style. Its navy rivaled the West. The world watched, some with admiration, others with unease. But here is the quiet truth. Every rise carries within it the seed of its fall. The very speed of Japan's transformation made it hungry for resources, for territory, for recognition. The old warrior spirit did not vanish. It simply wore new armor, and that hunger would draw Japan onto a path lined with victories so dazzling and a collapse so total that even the black ships would seem like a distant, harmless ripple. For now, though, the empire's sails were full. Its eyes were on horizons unimagined, and beneath the surface, in the currents no one could yet see, the tide had already begun to turn. But this was only the first shadow of what history has yet to tell. The year was 1905. The winter sea off the coast of Manchuria was hard and gray, a steel mirror under a pale sky. Out on those waters, Japan, a nation that just decades earlier had not even touched a steam engine, now commanded one of the most modern fleets in the world. And in the Battle of Tsushima, it shattered the Russian Baltic fleet in a victory so complete that the Western press called it the dawn of a new age. This was not just a naval triumph, it was a declaration. An Asian power had defeated a European empire, something unthinkable in the age of colonial dominion, in Tokyo's streets. Lanterns glowed through the night. Newspapers printed in black ink still smelled faintly of the oil lamps under which they had been set. Everywhere there was a sense that the sun had risen higher than it ever had before. The empire's appetite grew. Korea was annexed in 1910, Taiwan already held since the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. Japan reached into Manchuria, its industries hungry for coal, iron, and land. Its army marched with a discipline born from the ghost of the samurai, but now sharpened by factories, shipyards, and telegraph wires. Yet the heart of this empire was not made of steel alone. In the schoolrooms of Tokyo and Kyoto, children recited the imperial rescript on education, a text that bound loyalty to the emperor with the same sacred duty one sowed to a feudal lord. The emperor's portrait hung in every classroom, and to bow before it was not formality, but faith. It was this fusion of ancient loyalty and modern machinery that gave Japan its edge and also its fragility. For beneath the banners and parades, there were quiet murmurs. Farmers in the countryside groaned under rising taxes. City workers lived in the shadow of the smokestacks, their lives shortened by the very engines that powered the empire's rise. And beyond Japan's shores, other powers were watching closely, some with respect, others with the wary eye of those who know a rival is growing too quickly. The Great War of 1914 came like a storm over Europe. Japan, bound by alliance to Britain, seized German possessions in the Pacific with relative ease. By war's end, the empire's flag flew over islands scattered like stepping stones across the ocean. The West, distracted and exhausted, seemed to leave Japan to its own ambitions. But ambition is a tide, it does not stop when it reaches the shore. The 1920s brought both triumph and tremor. In 1923, the Great Earthquake leveled Tokyo and Yokohama in minutes. Firestorms swept through wooden neighborhoods, and the air filled with the smell of charred timber and the cries of the missing. Yet from the ashes, the capital was rebuilt, stronger and more modern than before, proof, perhaps, that Japan could master not just enemies, but the very forces of nature. Still, the global currents were shifting. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 sought to cap Japan's fleet, binding it in ratios that placed it below Britain and the United States. To some, it was a prudent measure to avoid an arms race. To others in Japan, it was an insult, a reminder that, to the Western powers, their empire was still to be kept in its place. Nationalist voices grew louder. In the shadows, secret societies and military cliques whispered of a destiny yet unfulfilled. They spoke of Asia for the Asians, of liberating lands from Western rule, though in truth, liberation often meant replacing one master with another. By the 1930s, the whispers had become gunfire. In 1931, Japan seized Manchuria outright, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the move. Japan simply walked away from the League. It was as though the empire had stepped off the map of diplomacy and onto a road of its own making. Factories roared, churning out tanks, ships, and aircraft. The martial spirit was no longer confined to the barracks. It was in the newspapers, in the films, in the songs sung by children on their way to school. In the shrines, prayers for the emperor's eternal reign blended seamlessly with calls for sacrifice in battle. Yet even as the empire's shadow stretched across East Asia, the cracks deepened, resources were strained. The population bore the weight of endless militarization, and still the hunger grew. The generals looked southward toward the oil-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. But such a move would mean confronting the Western powers head-on. Some warned of disaster. Others saw it as inevitable, and in this tension between caution and conquest, the empire stood poised on the edge of a precipice. The same spirit that had once lifted it from isolation now pushed it toward a gamble so vast that the fall, if it came, would echo for generations. And still, the trail led further into a darkness older than the empire itself. It began, as so many endings do, with silence before the storm. In the early hours of December 7, 1941, a quiet sea stretched before the Hawaiian island of Oahu. Above it, in the cold, high air, Japanese pilots gripped their controls. They had trained for months, memorizing every turn of Pearl Harbor's waters. Their mission was not conquest alone, it was shock, the kind of blow that would unnerve an empire before the first reply could be fired. When the bombs fell, they shattered more than ships. They shattered any hope that Japan's rise could be contained without war. The Pacific erupted. From the jungles of Malaya to the coral atolls of the Central Pacific, Japanese forces moved with a speed that stunned the world. Manila fell. Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress, surrendered in days. The rising sun flag was planted on shores that had never before felt its shadow for a moment. The empire's reach seemed limitless. The spirit of the samurai reshaped into the will of the soldier marched under banners that now fluttered from Burma to the Solomon Islands. In Tokyo, victory parades wound through streets lit with lanterns, and the newspapers spoke of destiny fulfilled. But destiny is a fragile thing. The very size of Japan's new dominion stretched, its lifelines thin. Oil, steel, and food had to travel across seas that soon became battlegrounds. The United States, wounded but unbroken, brought its vast industrial power to bear. Island by island, battle by battle, the tide began to turn. Guadalcanal, Midway, Saipan, each name became a grave marker in the empire's path. The code of so long the heartbeat of Japan's warriors now drove men into battles they could not win, into charges that ended in silence and smoke. Entire garrisons fought to the last man rather than surrender, for in the empire's creed, to live without honor was worse than to die. And so death became common, not just for soldiers, but for civilians. Cities across the home islands trembled under the roar of bombers. By 1945, Tokyo burned in a single night of firebombing that left more than 100,000 dead. The smell of smoke clung to the ruins for weeks. Still, the emperor's voice was silent. Still, the nation fought on. Then, in August of that same year, the world itself seemed to change. On the morning of the 6th, the city of Hiroshima lay beneath a sky as clear as glass. At 8:15 a.m., a light brighter than the sun burst overhead. In an instant, buildings became shadows on the ground. A city's heartbeat stopped. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The bombs were unlike any weapon before them, fire-harnessed from the very fabric of creation. And yet, even then, some argued to continue the war. Some believed that surrender would be a shame too deep for the nation to bear. But for the first time in centuries, the voice of the emperor, long shrouded in ritual and mystery, reached the ears of his people. Over crackling radios, Hirohito spoke of enduring the unendurable and accepting defeat to save what remained of Japan. On September 2, 1945, aboard the deck of the USS Missouri, representatives of the empire signed the documents of surrender. The pen scratched across the paper with the finality of a sword returning to its sheath. Outside, the bay was crowded with ships, not the black ships of Commodore Perry, but the steel fleets of a new world order. The Japanese Empire was gone, but its story did not vanish with it. In the years that followed, the same discipline that had once fueled conquest now turned inward. The factories rebuilt not for war, but for industry. The cities rose again, cleaner and brighter. The samurai's spirit, stripped of its sword, found a place in the precision of craftsmanship, the relentless pursuit of excellence. And yet, something older still lingers. In the temples of Kyoto, incense curls upward as it has for centuries. In the mountain villages, shrines stand quiet under the snow. The lessons of the empire, of its rise and fall, are not kept only in books, but in the spaces between words, in the pauses of those who remember. Perhaps the greatest truth the Japanese Empire left behind is not about power, but about its limits. That no matter how high a nation climbs, it is bound by the same law that binds the cherry blossom. The beauty lies in its moment, and the moment must pass. History rarely grants us perfect endings. Only reflections faint, like the moon in a still pond. And so we are left to ask, what did the empire truly gain in its rise? What did it lose in its fall? And are those losses ever truly gone, or do they live on in the quiet ways a people carry their past into the future? Perhaps the past is not behind us at all. but all around us, waiting for the right eyes to see. Which truths do you think history has yet to reveal? Share your thoughts. The conversation is part of the discovery until the next story finds us. Keep listening for the footsteps of the past.